My name is Carrie Akroyd. I'm the current president of the John Clare Society. In the middle of July each year, when it's around the birthday of John Clare, people from the society go to Helpston, the village that he came from, which is between Peterborough and Stamford, to join together to celebrate his life and his poetry. And normally I would be giving an address on that occasion, and this year, of course, it's been cancelled. So this is the address that I'm doing now, and it'll be about 20 minutes, and I'll try to punctuate it with a few pictures. 2020 was going to be a special year as well, so it's a shame we can't meet, because it's 200 years since the publication of Clare's first book of poems, which was called Rural Life and Scenery, Poems Descriptive of Rural Life and Scenery by John Clare, the Northamptonshire peasant. And this collection of poems collects stuff that he did as a teenager, right up to a song that he wrote practically before the book just went to press. So it's a real mixture of his styles, language, mood. It really is an introduction to the various voices that Clare has, and to his character and his creative mind. Of course, Clare had already published things in newspapers and periodicals, but to have a book was a great leap forwards. It brought him to a wider audience, and it satisfied this yearning that he had to be recognised, to be reassured that he really did have a talent. There are some poems in it, though, that spring from his despair that he ever would get acknowledgement. So he'd been writing for probably nearly 10 years. And he believed in his own talent. So he didn't write sort of like self-pitying, wallowing, teenage angst kind of poems, oh, why is the world against me? But it was trying really hard to keep himself at his task. And so it's appropriate that in this book there are actually two poems entitled To Hope. The first poem, To Hope, is his recognition that hope is what is keeping him going. That every time he feels like giving up and he has disappointments and a whisper in his ear telling him that he's not good enough and there's no point, hope is the thing that keeps him going. And he writes about it like this. He says, I still must hug thee, hope, to my breast. Like a weaning child that's lost its rattle, without my toy I cannot rest. And I love it that in the loftiness of his ambition, the image that he uses for his need for hope is a baby needing a rattle, such a domestic, small domestic image. The later poem, To Hope, is a sonnet in which he says that hope is a cheat, that all it does is aggravates his distress by whispering joys I never can possess. He's not asking for the moon. He has modest desires, and in a poem called The Poet's Wish, he gives some idea about what a difference it would make to have a little more. The Poet's Wish. But 'tis not thoughts of being rich that make my wishing spirit itch. 'Tis just an independent fate betwixt the little and the great. No out of the way, nor random wish, no ladle craved for silver dish. 'Tis but a comfortable seat, while without work both ends would meet. 'Tis just get hand to mouth with ease, and read and study as I please. Because, of course, he met people who had lives of leisure and had time to do just that, read and study as they pleased. But he tries not to fantasise. There's another poem called Address to a Lark Singing in Winter, where he wonders that the lark can sing so much and believe that spring is coming. He says, it's much better to wish for nothing till it's sent thee, for disappointments will torment thee. And sometimes things are hard. There's another poem, What is Life? What is life? A trial that all must undergo, which is a sort of, some of the poems have a religious background to them as well. Just that usual thought about whether there's an afterlife, a better life coming. But what is happiness? A bubble on the stream. But Clare always finds great consolation in the world around him. He writes a sonnet to the River Gwash. How many poets write a sonnet to a river? Although actually it's not to the river so much as to the pleasure of sitting by and looking at it, watching the reflections and watching the flow and getting consolation from it. Oh, thus, while musing wild, I'm doubly blessed, my woes unheeding and my heart at rest. Clare is in love with language. He knows many people who are illiterate, including his mother and his wife-to-be, and he's interested in the kind of language that illiterate people might use and contrasted with that writing and educated people use. And he's listening to it all the time. So the variousness of language always engages his thoughts. One of the poems in this book that I particularly like and quote when I do talks is A Scene. And in it he lists everything that he can see if he's standing and looking across the parish, or sort of like with telescopic eyes. It's as though he's got a wide-angle lens and a magnifying glass as he looks at everything. So listing all the things that he can see and saying, all these, with hundreds more, far off and near, approach my sight, and please to such excess that language fails the pleasure to express. And this is still a conundrum for us today. Can you think without language? And he has another poem about this idea. The Dawning of Genius. Clare considers the rough, rude ploughman who will witness and admire raptures the while his inward powers inflame, and joys delight him which he cannot name. Ideas picture pleasing views to mind, for which his language can no utterance find. Thus, pausing wild on all his saunters by, he feels enraptured, though he knows not why, and hums and mutters o'er his joys in vain, and dwells on something which he can't explain. When Clare's out in the wild, his desire to find the exact and specific word for what he's looking at impels him sometimes to write the poems out there on the spot, looking at his subject, to have the immediacy and the correct tone and language. But other times he emulates other poets, or the idea of poetry. And sometimes the two tones crash in one poem. There's a poem called The Fountain, which is just what he calls a spring. where he has a contrast between the sort of local voice and the classical voice, and some interesting words. So, when the sun bids good night, the west sky glowered with copper red, the sun bid good night and slove to bed. And later on he wangs his hat. The fountain. I just streaked down and with a swish wanged my hat, soaped like a fish. Think Colin Firth in Pride and Prejudice. When both what heart could think or wish, for chance there's no accounting, a sweet lass came with wooden dish and dipped it in the fountain. And a bit later on in the same poem. Ye leaning palms, palms? That seem to look pleased o'er your image in the brook, ye ashers harbouring pie and rook, ye shady boughs bemounting, ye muses leave Castalia's nook, that's the spring at Delphi, and sacred make the fountain. That's not a voice he uses very often afterwards. But it's not just the language, it's the subject that sometimes brings out his local voice or a local voice. Who can't enjoy My Mary? It's sad that that was dropped from later editions. I think this is the kind of poem that he read out in the pub. My Mary, just 3 verses. For though in stature mighty small, and near as thick as thou art tall, the hand that made thee made us all, my Mary. And though thy nose hooks down too much, and prophesies thy chin to touch, I'm not so nice to look at such, my Mary. No, no, about thy nose and chin, it's hooking out or bending in, I never heed nor care a pin, my Mary. Of course, there are many poems about girls. When it's in a boy's voice, they're always besotted and devoted by the girl's beauty. When it's in a girl's voice, and Clare is very good at writing about the girl's situation, it's often about being deceived. And there's quite a few mentions of death in the poems as well, which probably wasn't so odd in those days as it seems to us. But maybe not so odd now that we're a bit more plague aware. Taylor records that Clare knew the 3rd book of Job by heart, and that's nearly all about death. So among the rural life and scenery, there's a surprisingly large amount of poems that are politically angry. Clare is holding a banner, and was it audacious of the publisher to include them in this time after Peterloo and during a time of great demands for political reform? There were cuts in later editions. I'm just going to look at a few of his more angry political poems now. So the first poem in the book, about Helpston, he can switch in an instant from close natural observation and anguish about the loss of things that he loved that were all taken away by the alterations of the parish due to the Enclosure Act. He describes whirligig beetles spinning round and round on the brook, and then says, but of course now the brook is gone. So he relates all the things that lived in their habitats, and then that the habitats have been taken away. But he also says, that even something like a post or a mossy stone, he hates change. He hates things being taken away. He says, it grieved me at heart to witness their removes. And his conclusion is, accursed wealth, O abounding human laws, of every evil thou remainst the cause. Could have been written by Shelley. And then even more directly, an address to plenty in winter, a personification of plenty, but it's an address directly to the rich. It's a contemplation on how little would be needed to make the poor upgrade to a better life. To plenty, O thou bliss, to riches known, stranger to the poor alone, giving most where none's required, leaving none where most's desired. Deep and deeper falls the snow, labour slack and wages low. And he has a fantasy about living an idle life, if he could meet such. Then might bawl the restless cock and the loud-tongued village clock, and the flail might lump away, waking soon as dreary day. They should never waken me, independent, blessed and free. But really, depressed with want and poverty, I sink, I fall, denied by thee. And then there's To a favourite tree. What hadst thou done to meet a tyrant's frown? Small value was the ground on which thou stood, but gain's rude rage it was that cut thee down and dragged thee captive from thy native wood. So Clare writes about how the political decision-making of the wealthy affects the environment, but also how it affects people. There's another poem about the village funeral, after contemplating the fate of orphans at a mother's funeral. Yon workhouse stands as their asylum now, the place where poverty demands to live, where parish bounty scowls his scornful brow and grudges the scant fare he's forced to give. Oh, may I die before I'm doomed to seek that last resource of hope but ill supplied, to claim the humble pittance once a week, which justice forces from disdainful pride. And it's not just about money. He's also thinking about how cruelty, there's a poem on cruelty, how it kind of works down through the layers. It's the trickle-down effect, only it's the trickle-down of how oppression works, and that at the very bottom of it, it's the animals that get it. So he writes on cruelty, which is about man's treatment of animals. Inhuman man, in vengeance, heaps cruelty on all the lower train. So it's in vengeance. It's not vengeance against the animals, it's about vengeance against the state of his own life. But there are plenty of poems about landscape and seasons and his acute observations, so we'll cheer up and talk about his taste of summer. Summer Evening is one of the key poems in the book. It's one of Clare's typical marvellous poems describing everything in the village and the parish in the summer evening, from what the workers are doing, what the domestic animals are doing, what the wild animals are doing, the birds, the insects, and again, using that wide-angle lens and the magnifying glass. And his careful observations that he's made of things. So he's been watching house martins. Round the pond the martins flirt, their snowy breasts bedaubed with dirt, while the mason 'neath the slates each mortar-bearing bird awaits. By art untaught, each labouring spouse curious daubs his hanging house. As well as the Summer Evening, there's a companion poem, Summer Morning, which is the sort of lesser partner of the two, really. But it still has lots of nice images. When Clare talks about bents, he's talking about a particular kind of grass. So, now, in gay, green, glossy coat, on the shivering benty balk, the free grasshopper chirps his note, bounding on from stalk to stalk. And finally, we'll look at noon. Noon. we had some hot days, didn't we? So this is one of those hot days when they valued being able to shelter from the heat more than we do. We tend to bask in it. They want to hide away from it. All how silent and how still, nothing heard but yonder mill, while the dazzled eye surveys all around a liquid blaze. Shepherds with their panting sheep in the swaliest corner creep, and from the tormenting heat all are wishing to retreat. Huddled up in grass and flowers, mowers wait for cooler hours. For myself, a place is good in the middle of a wood. I love it that the mowers are huddled up in grass and flowers in the hayfield. Well, we're usually blessed with good weather when we meet at Helpston to celebrate Claire's birthday. And let's hope that we're all able to meet there next year on another sunny day in Helpston.